Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. George Yancey. He's Professor of Sociology at the Baylor University. He has published several research articles on the topics of institutional racial diversity, racial identity, academic bias, progressive Christians, and anti-Christian hostility, and we're going to talk about those topics today. So, Dr. Yancey, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, great. So, first, one basic, I think, question. So, would you say that, and because we're going to focus, of course, on the US, do you think that American society is racialized? And if so, what would that mean?
Yeah, I would say it clearly is racialized. To me, there's no doubt about that. Probably more so than any other society than perhaps South Africa. And what I mean by that is that race matters in ways that doesn't in other societies. The way we interpret race, the way that we say, I'm an African American, and what does that mean, and things of this nature. There's more of a focus on that. Despite all the talk about how we're post-racial and stuff like that, there's more of a focus on that than in other societies. And that's what I mean by we're racialized. The race matters in our life opportunities, our life chances, everything like that.
Mm-hmm. So what would you say are some of the most important domains of people's lives where their race has an impact?
Yeah, I think it impacts, maybe the most important part is how we think about things. When I enter into situations, I'm not saying it's the only thing that matters, but me being Black matters on how I interpret what's happening before me. So, I'm not even saying that's the most important thing that matters. I'm just saying it matters. Whereas perhaps in other countries, it really wouldn't matter. It would, other things would matter, but not that. And so the way we interpret things, the way our politics plays out, I think clearly shows that we interpret our political realities in part due to our racial identity. As research shows that African Americans are less likely to see society as fair compared to European Americans. And so there's that before we even get into the possibilities of discrimination or prejudice or structural discrimination. It just shapes our minds on how we see things.
Mm-hmm. But Black Americans are discriminated against in American society.
The nature of the discrimination has changed, but it still happens. We're not living in Jim Crow or slavery or anything like that. And I think it's always important to have perspective. But there's research that shows that if African American calls in for a job and a white person calls in for a job, the African American is less likely to get the call back. They've done these audit studies to show this is the case. There's research that shows that Blacks are more likely to be pulled over by the police. All other things being equal, So yeah, there is discrimination that does occur. It's more. It's not as, I want to say it's more subtle. It's more institutionalized. Institutions treat us differently, than it has been in the past, but it still impacts our life chances.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that there's some institutional racism, right?
Right. Institutional racism is different from personal racism. Okay. Personal racism is someone treats you differently because of your race. Institutional racism is the institution, regardless of how people in there feel. So it's not about, personalized racism. It's about the institution. And we know that this is true, say, criminal justice system. We know that all things being equal, if you're an African American and Hispanic American, you're more likely to be convicted, have a heavier sentence, more likely to be charged, more likely to be arrested, all sorts of these different things. And it's not necessarily the individual, his or herself, is racist, is we have an institution that works against the people of color in this way.
Mm-hmm. But is there also systemic racism? Because I would guess that that's different from institutionalized racism, or not.
Yeah, I mean, Uh, I tend to think of the institutionals as the way systemic racism occurs. That institutions allow it to be systematic, whereas an individual can by definition not be systematic. If a person, his or herself, is racist, they're racist to all those people around them. But even the whole institution, criminal justice system, it could be systematically discriminatory against, almost all people who enter into it. So I think the institutions as a way systematic racism occurs.
So apart from discrimination and racism, what are some of the causes behind racial disparities that we see in the US? Because, I mean, if you ask people on the left or on the right, they have different answers to that question.
Sure.
So what is your take on it?
I mean, that's a multifaceted question. Obviously, I do believe institutional racism and some forms of personal racism play a role in it. I think our history of racism plays a form in it. Look at residual segregation. That didn't happen by accident. And then, if you read Yancey and Dissenter, there's all sorts of pernicious effects due to residual segregation. I would say, are there cultural factors that could play a role in it? Yes. I'm not going to say it's just about racism. There could be certain cultural differences that could play a role in what happens in our society. Black kids are told, black boys are told, your way out is professional sports. The chances of you being LeBron James is not very high. But they get those signals, and I know from being in the black community, we didn't get the strong signals of do well educationally. So there are cultural factors that play a role in this as well. So it's a very multifaceted dynamic that occurs that creates these sort of inequalities. I don't, I think in theory physical differences could matter, but I would downplay that very, very dramatically. I don't think the physical differences are great enough to really have an impact. There may be some, but I don't think that they're really that great enough. I think it's more cultural and then some of these racialized factors.
Mm-hmm. So talking about the culture, do you agree when people on the right say that, for example, two of the biggest problems in black communities are the fact that there are more single-parent families than we find in other races, I think, and also sometimes they mention lack of personal responsibility. So do you agree with that?
Well, if you say the two biggest factors, I won't agree with that. If you say they are factors, I'm not going to deny that they are factors. I'm not going to deny that. Now, let's just take the single-parent family, for example. Mm-hmm. All sorts of research shows that two parents are better than one parent. For financial reasons, we know that it's the case as far as kids, as far as delinquency, education, all that sort of stuff. So the fact that African Americans are more like one single parent as opposed to two parents has got to impact the life chances of the kids. But you have to go a step further than that. Why is it they only have a single parent family? Now, I'm not going to just say it's racism, because you can look at something like Hispanic families, and they tend, Mexican American families tend to have a lot of two-parent families. So it's not just pure racism, but it plays a role. And so it's not just, is there something internal in African American culture that leads to higher likelihood of single-parent families? I'm not opposed to that idea. But it also interacts, I believe, with our racialized society to exacerbate it. So that's how I would see it. It's. I wish I could just tell you here's the answer A and that's it. But that's not the way society works. Society rarely is there just one explanation for what's happening, and so you have to look at it that way.
Right. And since we find these racial disparities, at least in the U.S. Because blacks usually show poor results in several different social metrics, can we say that whites are privileged in some way?
Yeah. Yeah. There's white privilege, which I think there's a good body of data showing that there is some degree of privilege out there. There are other things that people assert that I look for the body of data and it's just not there. But white privilege, I think, is fairly solid. But even if there wasn't white privilege, I think there's just a comparative advantage that you get if one group does not perform as well. And so, I don't know how well you know about American baseball or Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play baseball. Before that, before he started playing baseball, if you're a white baseball player, the only people you had to beat out was other whites in order to make the team. I'm not saying it was easy, but that's all you had to beat out. After Jackie Robinson comes in and other blacks come in, now you must compete against the other white and now African American baseball players. It makes it harder for you to succeed. Doesn't mean you can't succeed. Obviously, you still had great white baseball players after Jackie Robinson, but it was harder to succeed. I think if you think about it, that makes sense when you look at other dynamics of our society. The African Americans have a harder time becoming CEOs, and you're a European American, regardless of whether or not you are a person who racist yourself. You have it a little bit easier because all you have to compete against is other white CEOs or CEO candidates. You don't have to compete against people of color as candidates because they have it harder, or very few people of color candidates because they have it harder. So there's a comparative advantage in our society to being white, regardless of anything else. And as long as we have these inequities, that's what we'll have.
Mm-hmm. So, sometimes people talk about white guilt, but is this a real phenomenon, white guilt?
As far as do some whites feel guilty?
Yeah, feel guilty from, things that happened in the past.
I've met with some of them. Yeah, some whites do. Yeah, that's a real phenomenon. I don't think it's been studied very much because I don't think a lot of academics are interested in studying that, but that would be an interesting phenomenon to study. There's been some research, I'll take that back, there's been some research on white anti-racists. I think they touch on it, but they don't really go in depth on it. So I think you can find some work, more qualitative work, when we look at some of those literature on white anti-racists.
Mm-hmm. And is white supremacy something that people should worry about in American society?
I think it depends on how you define it. I don't worry about the KKK anymore, personally. I mean, is it possible that I'll be singled out by some crazed? Yeah, but it's also possible I'll be singled out by crazed anybody, a crazed Muslim, I mean, that's possible. I don't go around worrying about radical Muslims, but I'm not going to say that's not possible, or a crazed another African-American who just, whatever. But if you define white supremacy more broadly, as far as, getting away from the whole violence, that sort of thing, but you define it more broadly as far as, systems in our society that benefit European Americans, that's more problematic. And that's why when I teach sociology of race and ethnicity, I really don't focus a lot on white supremacists or clans or violent terrorists or anything. I really, because I don't think that that's the big problem in our society today. They're out there, they exist, but you can find crazy groups of people anywhere, and we don't worry about most of them because usually they don't do very much. But I think the systematic problems is what we need to focus in on, and that's what I focus in on when I teach race ethnicity.
Mm-hmm. So in your work you talk about transcending racial barriers, but first could you tell us what these racial barriers are?
Yeah, the way I've come to think about it is, we've had in our country centuries of racial abuse. Very overt racial abuse, not just blacks with slavery, but Native Americans on reservations, the way Hispanic Americans were forced to do dirty labor, mistreatment of Asian Americans. So we had centuries of that. All right, so that has created dynamics in our society which impact all of us. How do we overcome that in a fair manner in our society? I think that's the big question. Is it, some people would argue that, well, what we have to do is just concentrate on compensating people of color, and I get that, and that's true up to a point. But can you get to where you overcompensate? I mean, to put it brutally, we've had 400 years of slavery. Is it a fair thing to make whites slaves for 400 years and now everything's equal? I don't think we want that. I mean, that's an exaggeration to show that, yes, you can overcompensate. how do you deal with that? I think that's the real barrier that we have that we're struggling with in our society, because there's really very few people who are overt supremacists today. So it's not the same problem we had in the 1950s or 60s, where people did not think much of people of color. They didn't think that we were fully human. I don't think that that's the big problem today. The big problem is, how do we overcome our centuries of racial abuse to create a fair society for today? And I think we're struggling with that. I think that that's the source of a lot of our racial conflict, even though people don't articulate it in that way.
Mm-hmm. So, and what would be some of the best strategies to transcend those racial barriers?
Well, I've been an advocate of having more collaborative conversations in order to solve problems, not just talk for the sake of talking, but to solve problems, and to try to find win-win situations, win-win solutions, to take into consideration everyone's interests and then figure it out. And I think there's research out there that shows in other settings that that works. And so I've been advocating that we need to bring this into the racial setting. That we got to figure out a way to stop talking past each other and talk to each other. And so that's I think that's the best solution, the way forward that I see. But I'm not going to pretend that it's an easy problem to solve, because it's not. And it's not just because it's a hard problem intellectually, but it's a hard problem emotionally to solve. And sometimes that makes it that makes it all the more difficult to solve our problems.
In that case, can exposing people to a diverse social context help in any way?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think in order to have these conversations, we have to first be exposed to people of other groups under the right conditions, under the conditions that contact hypothesis says is very helpful, so that people are relatively equal with each other, that there's support from relevant authority figures, working towards a larger goal, those sort of things. So yeah, I'm a big proponent of contact. You've seen my book, so I've written a couple of books on interracial contact, and I think that is part of the solution. It's not the entire solution, but I think it's part of the solution. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that other solutions like reparations, that people should implement them and they would help in some way?
Reparations is an interesting problem. What I would say is, if at the end of having these conversations we decide on reparations, that's fine. I would oppose imposing reparations without without developing the background to where we can discuss this, and people can be more on board with it. And the reason why is, if you want to think about it this way, let's say that President Biden has this Blue Ribbon Commission and they impose these reparations. So they give all African Americans, let's say, I've seen figures like $40,000, $60,000. Let's say $50,000, which makes my life a little bit easier, so I'm not complaining. All right, so that money goes out. What happens the very next day? The very next day, all people who are not African Americans say, okay, you all got your money, now just shut up. I don't want to hear your complaints anymore. You all got paid off. What does it do for our race relations? Does it improve our race relations, or does it create resentment? Does it create hostility? You see, if you just impose solutions on people, then you're going to get a lot of resistance. But people work through the solutions and with others, and if at the end of the day, people decide, part of our solution is reparations, then I would be on board. But I can't be on board with just imposing that, because I think that's actually going to make race relations worse 5-10 years from now. We're going to tell the poor white kid in Appalachia, why he didn't get $50,000, but this poor black kid did. We could come up with academic explanations for that. Don't get me wrong, but that's not going to make sense to that poor white kid. He's going to be resenting these black kids for the rest of his life. So I think we have to think longer term than just trying to get a short-term solution like reparations.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of establishing these sort of dialogues between different races to try to solve these racial disparities we've been talking about, do people of color in that case, would they also have obligations toward dominant groups?
They would have the obligation to work with them, yes. Yes, this has to be a mutual process. It cannot be, and it's what some people are trying to make it, is whites showed up and listened, people of color talk, that will not work. That will not work. People of color have an obligation to try to understand where whites are coming from. They don't have to agree with them, and I'm not requiring whites to agree with people of color. But if they understand where they're coming from, then we can fashion solutions that we can live with. And so, yeah. Now, when I talk about a mutual obligations approach, I'm not saying that the solution is going to be equal for everyone. I suspect the solution is going to be some sort of compensation for people of color, more so than what whites receive. I expect that. If it doesn't turn out that way, okay, I can live with that. But that's what I suspect is going to happen. But to enter into the conversation is an obligation everyone has.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so now talking a little bit about theories in sociology. So when it comes to trying to tackle these issues, people bring to the table, for example, critical race theory. But is that something that allows for us to understand these social phenomena through a new lens or not?
I think almost every theory brings something that gives us insight that we didn't have before. And probably every theory has its own shortcomings. And I think critical race theory, because it focuses in on the sort of structural inequities in our society based on race, and helps us to locate where they are at. It brings that. I mean, it helps us to understand that. Is that sufficient to solve racial problems? No. But is that necessary for us to get to where we need to get to? Yes. So yeah, I mean, I think CRT has something to offer us. I just would not look to CRT to solve the racial problems, because I don't think it's designed to do that, even though people talk about how it can. I don't think it's really designed to do that. I think it's designed to be a diagnostic tool more than anything else. I think we use it in that way. I think it'd be very useful.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that faith can unite people?
Yeah, it can also divide people. Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt about that. But yeah, I mean, there's plenty of research showing both happening.
Mm-hmm. So, and it's interesting because since in my show I interview lots of scientists, these are topics that don't come about very frequently. But would you say that Christianity, because you study that, is fundamentally racist?
No, not fundamentally. I mean, there's nothing inherently racist about Christianity. Obviously, some Christians are racist. Christianity also helped to lead the abolition movement here in this country. Wilberforce also was a Christian, and because of his Christianity, fought against the slave trade. Now, once again, Christians also used the Bible to justify slavery, to justify mistreating the people. So I'm not trying to paint this picture of flowers and roses, but because of some of the Wilberforce and Yancey sisters and you can't I don't see how you can say it fundamentally is racist. It can be used in a racist manner, clearly.
Mm-hmm. So when we think about religion, at least people on the left tend to associate religious people with conservatism. But there are also, for example, when it comes to Christianity, progressive Christians. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Christianity spans the spectrum in the United States, at least. I can't attest to other countries. It spans the spectrum across political. You are more likely to be political conservative if you're highly Christian. You're more likely to, but there's plenty of Christians who are highly religious who are politically progressive too.
Mm-hmm. Is there anti-Christian hostility in the US? Because I mean, it's easy, for example, for people to talk about discrimination against atheists, but is
Sure.
there specifically discrimination against Christians in the US?
Yeah, I think that there is in certain areas, and the way to look at it is, when I did my research on anti-Christian attitudes, I found that people more likely to have them tend to be more educated, tend to be wealthier, white males. So these people with power in our society, and discrimination is going to look different when you have power than when you don't have power. When you don't have power, if when you're poor and you're uneducated and you don't like a group, you don't like Muslims, you're going to lash out violently against them. You're going to be physically violent against them because that's what you can do. When you have education power, economic power, you can engage in discrimination that's not violent in the physical sense, but can punish others occupationally or economically, and I think there's evidence of that. I'll just give you one case study. Mm-hmm. University of Iowa had made up a rule saying that your student organizations had to include people of all different religions, and so when they enforced the rule, they only enforced the rule against Christian organizations. There was a Muslim organization that clearly, they had in their bylaws, Muslims, in their leadership, and they didn't enforce it against them. They only enforced it against Christians. So the Christians sued and said, you have to enforce it against, you have to enforce it against everybody. And so they started trying to do that, but they ran afoul again because they were not enforcing it against, for example, I think there was this Asian, like an Asian accounting organization, some one of those like, and in their bylaws they said, well you have to have these certain beliefs in order to be part of, you have to respect Asian culture, or it may have been Korean or something like that, but that's a belief, and boom, once again they're in trouble again. And so my interpretation is they, like some other colleges, are trying to enforce these certain rules against Christians. They got caught legally, but had they not been caught, basically they would only enforce an ideological purity test on Christian groups and no one else. So to me, I think that's and there's other cases, but to me that's evidence that there are times where Christians do face discrimination in our society.
Mm-hmm. So one last question before we go. So we've already talked about transcending racial barriers. Is it also possible to transcend religious barriers? And I think that's relevant to talk about today because in politics in recent years, people have been focusing a lot on issues like immigration and more specifically Muslim immigration. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I am a Christian, so I'm not ashamed of that in the slightest, but I live in a society of people with different religious beliefs, and I'm perfectly comfortable with that. I think the United States has a chance to do that. In fact, I think to some degree, and I say this as a Christian, because Christians are no longer have majority group power in our society, I don't think that they do, it increases our opportunity to do that. Now, Christians are not in a position culturally to enforce their will on others for the most part. Christians don't have power in the media. They don't have power in academia. They don't have power in the arts, in entertainment. The question is, will others, now that they have power, try to use their power against groups like Christians? And if they don't, I think we could truly have a religious multicultural society in the United States, kind of a pluralism where groups do what they want, and there's equality. What we think about as far as cultural pluralism could actually happen in our society. I would like to see that. I would like to see that develop in our society over time. I'm 50-50 on whether it's going to do it. I think there's a chance we can do it, but because I can also see how it could turn sideways as well. But yeah, I think I think a society where you have different religions and people can decide what religions they want, and they decide without coercion. And all religions have, or non-religious beliefs have the right to the public square to say, hey, here's why you should believe what you believe. Why you believe, if you want to come over, that's fine. If not, you still have all your full rights as a citizen in society. You're not going to be discriminated against, except in specific religious. Obviously, I don't believe you should force a Muslim school to hire Jewish teachers or anything like that, stuff like that. But, beyond that, uh, yeah, I think that would be a great society. Can we get there? That's the big question.
And would that involve any form of multiculturalism?
Well, I think it would be a natural multiculturalism,
Okay.
and maybe it would take some socialization to learn how to accept people of different beliefs, of very different beliefs, beliefs that you totally disagree with, but you still accept them. In the you don't have to accept them into your house. You don't have to accept them into your church or synagogue or mosque. I mean, but in the workplace, at schools, in politics, I like to think I vote for the best person, regardless of their religious beliefs, but I'm voting for the person I think politically is best suited for the job. And I would happily vote for an atheist over a Christian if I thought the atheist was better suited for the job. Uh, but yeah, I think that is a possibility, and maybe we have to socialize people for it. I don't know if we're thinking deeply about it, because I think a lot of people still think that this is a Christian nation. A lot of Christians think this is a Christian nation. A lot of non-Christians think this is a Christian nation. The Christians are the dominant group. But as I've looked around, the Christians are no longer the dominant group. The dominant group. Are they a strong group? Yes. The dominant group relative to non-Christians in our society. If we look at economically, they're not doing any better than anyone else. Culture, they're not. Politically, they still have some power, but I think that's waning. So that's an opportunity for us to have a multicultural society if we are willing to step into it.
Great. So let's end on that note. Just before we go, are there any good places on the internet for people to find your work?
I mean, I'm on website georgeyancey.com, so I post my books there, and you can contact me through there, and that's how you can find me.
Okay, so I'll be leaving links to that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Yancey, it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you
Yeah,
for taking the time to come on the show.
it's been a pleasure talking to you, Ricardo. Have a good day.
Hello everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. My channel is now more than 3 years old, and to keep it sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of this interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters: Karen Litzke, Anne Blanchett, Pereira Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Vies, Elenian Kata, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Yugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Don Ross, João Alves da Silva, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Deza Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Usmani, Charlotte Please, Miran B., Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, my producers, Cesar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanegdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran. And finally, my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.